Emeka Obiora stood in the hallway of his mother's house at 11:42 at night, listening to the woman he loved cry in a car parked outside, and he did not move. He did not run to her. He did not open the door. He stood there with his hand flat against the wood, feeling his own heartbeat in his palm, because his mother was standing behind him, and his mother was smiling. "She will thank me one day," his mother said. "They all do. Eventually." That sentence would follow Emeka for the next 30 years of his life. It would sit in his chest like a stone he swallowed and never digested, because Adiz Obiora was not finished. She was never finished. And by the time Emeka understood what his mother had truly taken from him, he would be 61 years old, sitting alone in a house built for a family that never got the chance to exist, staring at a photograph of a woman whose name he had almost forgotten how to say out loud. But that comes later. If you are watching this from Houston, from Lagos, from London, from Atlanta, from anywhere in this wide world where a mother's love has ever felt like a leash, stay with this story. Subscribe before you go further because you will want to come back for what happens next, and drop in the comments right now where are you watching this from tonight. Let's see how far this story travels. Now let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning, to the first woman, to the first time Adiz Obiora smiled the way she smiled that night outside her son's bedroom door. Emeka was 23 the first time he brought a woman home. Her name was Ifeoma. She had skin the color of wet earth after rain and a laugh that made strangers on the street turn their heads. She was studying to become a pharmacist, and she carried herself like someone who had never once doubted her own worth, which, as it turned out, was exactly the kind of woman Adiz Obiora could not stand to be in a room with. Adiz had raised Emeka alone. His father, a quiet man named Chukwuemeka Sr., had died of a heart attack when Emeka was 11, collapsing in the doorway of their small flat in Enugu with a cup of tea still warm in his hand. Adiz never remarried. She used to tell people, with a kind of pride that made her neighbors uncomfortable, that she didn't need a man because she had her son, and her son was enough. Her son would always be enough. It was a sentence that sounded like love. It was not love. It was architecture. Adiz had spent 17 years building something inside Emeka, brick by careful brick, and she had no intention of letting a stranger walk in and knock it down. So when Ifeoma sat at the dinner table that first evening, laughing at something Emeka said, reaching across to touch his hand the way people do when they are not yet afraid to be seen loving someone, Adiz watched her son's face change. She watched the way his shoulders relaxed around this girl. She watched something in him come alive that she had never put there herself. And something in Adiz went cold. "You cook well," Adiz said to Ifeoma, over a plate of jollof rice that Ifeoma had made herself, hoping to impress. "It is a shame you didn't season the chicken properly. My son grew up eating real food. But it's all right. Not everyone was taught." Ifeoma's smile faltered just slightly, the way a candle flickers when a door opens somewhere in a house. Emeka laughed it off. "Mama, it's delicious." "I did not say it was terrible," Adiz said, her voice smooth as oil. "I said it's a shame. There's a difference, my son." That was the first cut. It was small. Small enough that Emeka told himself he'd imagined the sharpness in it. Small enough that Ifeoma told herself later that night, lying awake in her own bed, that perhaps she was overreacting, that mothers were simply protective, that this was a woman who loved her son fiercely and needed time. She did not know that Adiz had already made a decision. She did not know that this decision had been made the moment she touched Emeka's hand at that table. Over the following months the cuts became less small. Adiz called Emeka every single day. Not to check on him, she had never been the kind of mother to ask if he'd eaten, but to remind him of things. To remind him that Ifeoma's family came from a different kind of background. To remind him of a woman 2 streets over, the daughter of Adiz's church friend, who was more suited to a man like him. To remind him, in ways so subtle he could never quite identify the moment the poison entered the water, that something was wrong with the woman he was falling in love with. "Has she asked you for money yet?" Adiz asked one evening, stirring a pot of soup with her back to him, not even bothering to turn around. "Mama, no. Why would you say that? I'm only asking. Women like that always ask eventually." "Women like what?" Adiz turned then, and there was something in her eyes. Not anger, something quieter and more dangerous than anger. "You will see," she said. "I've lived longer than you. I've seen more than you. When you see it too, don't say I didn't warn you. This was the pattern. This would always be the pattern. Adiz never forbade. She never shouted. She never gave Emeka a reason he could point to and say this is unfair, this is cruel. Instead she planted seeds, small doubts, small suspicions, small comparisons, and she watered them patiently every single day, until they grew into something that strangled the relationship from the inside without her ever having to lift a finger against it directly. By the 8th month, Emeka found himself watching Ifeoma differently, wondering in moments he was ashamed of, whether she loved him for who he was or for what he could offer her, wondering whether the warmth in her eyes was real or performance. He didn't understand where these thoughts came from. He didn't understand that they weren't his own thoughts at all. They were his mother's thoughts, transplanted into his mind so gradually that he mistook them for instinct. Ifeoma noticed the change in him before he did. "You've stopped looking at me the way you used to," she told him one night, sitting on the edge of his bed, her voice trembling with something between grief and fury. "What is happening to you, Emeka?" "Nothing is happening. Something is happening. Every time I leave your mother's house, I feel like I've been interrogated. Every time you come from talking to her, you look at me like I'm a stranger you're trying to figure out." He didn't answer her. That was the problem. He never had an answer because he didn't understand it himself. All he knew was that a woman he had once wanted to marry now made him feel a low hum of suspicion he couldn't explain, and somewhere underneath that hum, if he'd been brave enough to listen, was his mother's voice. It ended 3 weeks later. Not with a dramatic fight. With silence. With Emeka failing to call for 4 days, and then 5, and then Ifeoma understanding in the particular quiet devastation that women like her come to know too well, that the man she loved had let something poison him against her, and that he either couldn't see it or didn't have the courage to fight it. She left a voicemail he listened to only once and never deleted. "I hope she's happy," Ifeoma said, her voice raw. "Whatever this is. Whatever she's protecting you from. I hope it's worth what she's costing you. Because Emeka, you are going to wake up one day, and you are going to be alone, and you are going to understand exactly what she did. I just hope it's not too late when you do." He sat in his car in the dark for over an hour after hearing that message. And when he finally went inside his mother's house, because he still lived there at 24 years old, a grown man tethered to his mother's roof, Adiz was waiting for him at the kitchen table with a plate of food, warm, covered, exactly the way he liked it. "You look tired," she said gently. "Sit. Eat. I made your favorite." And Emeka sat. And Emeka ate. And some small buried part of him understood, even then, that he had just watched his mother win a war he didn't know they were fighting. It would take him 17 more years and 4 more women to understand the scale of what he had lost that night, and by the time he understood it, the woman it would cost him the most would already be gone, carrying with her a secret Adiz Obiora had spent decades making sure her son would never discover. If you have a mother, a sister, a friend who has ever loved someone so much it became a cage, sit with that feeling for a moment because this story is only getting started. There is a second woman coming. There is a third. And there is a name, one single name, that Adiz Obiora forbade anyone in that house from ever speaking again, for reasons that will not make sense to you until the very end of this story. 2 years passed before Emeka brought another woman home, and this time, Adiz was ready before the girl had even taken off her shoes. Her name was Blessing. She was a schoolteacher, soft-spoken, careful with her words in a way that made Adiz's usual tactics, the veiled insults, the comparisons, the manufactured suspicion, slide off her like water off polished stone. Blessing simply smiled, answered every barbed comment with grace, and refused to give Adiz anything to work with. For the first time, Adiz Obiora met a woman she could not immediately unravel. It unsettled her in a way she didn't expect. She watched Blessing move through her kitchen, watched Emeka's eyes follow this woman with a tenderness she hadn't seen in years, and she understood with a cold clarity that if she didn't act differently this time, she might actually lose. So Adiz changed her strategy. She stopped attacking Blessing directly. Instead, she began to attack something else entirely. Something Emeka didn't even know was being attacked until it was already too late. She began telling a story. It started small at first, a comment here, a comment there, dropped so casually into conversation that no one thought to question it. "Blessing's family, you know," Adiz would murmur to a neighbor within Emeka's earshot. There was some trouble years ago. I won't say more. It's not my place. Or to her sister on the phone, loud enough to carry through the thin walls. I just worry, that's all. You hear things about people. You can't always tell from the outside. She never said what the trouble was. She never named a single fact Emeka could investigate or disprove. That was the genius of it, and the cruelty of it. A rumor with no shape cannot be fought, because there is nothing solid to grab hold of. It simply exists quietly, in the air of every room, until everyone in that room starts breathing it in without noticing. By the time Emeka began to feel the shift, the way his aunties looked at Blessing a little too long, the way his mother's church friends lowered their voices when Blessing walked past, 8 months had gone by, and the damage was already root deep. What are they saying about me? Blessing finally asked him one night, her hands trembling around a cup of untouched tea. People look at me like I've done something, like I'm hiding something. Emeka, what is your mother telling people? Nothing. She wouldn't do that. But even as he said it, something in his own chest recoiled, because a small, cowardly part of him, the same part that had failed Ifeoma 2 years before, was already beginning to wonder if it was true. Blessing saw that flicker of doubt cross his face, and something in her broke in that instant quietly, the way a bone cracks under weight long before it ever snaps. You believe her, she whispered. You don't even know what she's saying, and you already believe there's something to believe. That's not Blessing, that's not what I. It is exactly what you're doing, she said, standing, gathering her coat with hands that would not stop shaking. Your mother hasn't told you a single fact about me. Not one. And still, some part of you is standing there wondering what I might be hiding. Do you understand what that means, Emeka? It means she doesn't even need facts anymore. She just needs a shadow, and you'll do the rest yourself. She left that night, and unlike Ifeoma, she did not leave quietly. She stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and looked past Emeka to where Adiz sat in the sitting room, pretending to read her Bible by lamplight. I hope it was worth it, Blessing said, loud enough for the whole house to hear. Whatever you're protecting him from. I hope you sleep well tonight, Mama. Adiz did not look up from her Bible. I always sleep well, she said. I have a clean conscience. But that was a lie. Because 3 nights later, alone in her room, Adiz Obiora sat on the edge of her bed at 2 in the morning, staring at an old photograph she kept hidden in the bottom drawer of her dresser, beneath folded wrappers she never wore anymore. A photograph of a young woman who was not Ifeoma, was not Blessing, was not any of the women Emeka had ever brought home. A young woman with Emeka's exact eyes. Adiz pressed her thumb over the photograph's edge until it bent, the way she had done 100 times before, and whispered something into the dark of her bedroom that no one, not Emeka, not any of the women who had come and gone through that house, not a single living soul outside of Adiz herself, had ever heard. Not again, she said. I will not let it happen again. Not to him. Never to him. And somewhere in that sentence was the answer to everything, the reason for every ruined relationship, every whispered rumor, every cold dinner table remark. But Adiz closed the drawer, locked it, and went back to bed before the answer could fully form, and outside her window, a car pulled away from the curb carrying the second woman her son would spend the rest of his life failing to forget. The photograph stayed locked in that drawer for 6 more years, and in those 6 years, Emeka changed in ways even he didn't fully notice. He stopped bringing women to the house first. He started meeting them in secret, testing them against some invisible measuring stick before he ever let his mother near them, as though he already understood, somewhere beneath conscious thought, that Adiz was not simply protective. She was a filter, and everything that passed through her came out damaged. He told himself this was wisdom. He told himself he was finally learning. He did not understand that a man who has to hide the people he loves from his own mother has already lost something no woman would ever be able to fully repair. By the time he was 31, Emeka Obiora had built a life that looked, from the outside, entirely successful. He owned a logistics company that moved goods between Lagos and Port Harcourt, employed 19 people, drove a car his father could never have imagined owning. He had money. He had status. What he did not have, what everyone around him began to whisper about at weddings and christenings and Sunday service, behind cupped hands and lowered eyes, was a wife. When are you going to bring someone home for good, Emeka? His aunties would ask, laughing in that way that wasn't really laughter. He would smile and change the subject, and none of them ever noticed the flicker of something haunted that crossed his face in that half-second before the smile arrived. None of them knew about Ifeoma's voicemail, still unheard by anyone but him. Still saved on a phone he'd replaced 4 times since, transferred file by file like a wound he refused to let heal shut. None of them knew about Blessing standing in that doorway, her voice breaking as she asked his mother if she slept well at night. None of them knew about the third woman, the one nobody talks about. The one who came after Blessing, whose name Adiz had forbidden anyone in that house from ever saying again. A prohibition so absolute, so unlike anything Adiz had done before, that even Emeka, grown and successful and increasingly weary of his mother's grip, did not dare test it. Her name was Nkechi. If you're still with us, drop a comment right now and tell me, have you ever loved someone your family tried to warn you away from and later wished you'd listened, or wished you hadn't? Because what happened with Nkechi is the reason this story exists at all, and it changes everything you think you understand about Adiz Obiora. Emeka met Nkechi at a business conference in Abuja, 3 years before the point in our story we've just left. She was not soft-spoken like Blessing, not effortlessly radiant like Ifeoma. She was sharp, quick-tongued, the kind of woman who challenged him in a debate about supply chain logistics in front of 40 other people and then apologized for nothing afterward. He had never met anyone like her. He found himself thinking about her for 3 days after the conference ended, and when he finally called her, she laughed and said, "I wondered how long it would take you." For 8 months, Emeka did something he had never done before with any woman he'd loved. He kept her a complete secret from his mother. He told himself it was because things were still new. He told himself he wanted to be sure before he risked exposing her to Adiz's particular brand of quiet warfare. But the truth, buried somewhere he didn't want to look, was that some part of him had begun to suspect his mother wasn't simply protective. Some part of him had begun to suspect that his mother was afraid, and he didn't yet understand of what. Nkechi eventually found out about the secrecy, and unlike the 2 women before her, she didn't accept it gracefully. "You've never introduced me to your mother," she said one evening, sitting across from him at a restaurant in Victoria Island, her arms crossed, her voice carrying the particular calm of a woman who has already decided she is done being patient. 8 months, Emeka. 8 months, and I've never once set foot in that house. It's complicated. Everything with you is complicated. Your mother is complicated. Your past is complicated. I'm starting to wonder if you're complicated on purpose, so you never have to actually commit to anything real. The words landed harder than she probably intended, because they were true and Emeka knew they were true. And a man confronted with an uncomfortable truth by someone he loves will often do the very worst thing available to him. He will get angry, not at himself, but at the person who dared to say it out loud. "You don't understand what she's like," he snapped. "Then let me meet her. Let me understand for myself. Or is the truth that you're afraid of what she'll do to us? The same thing she did to whoever came before me." He went silent, and that silence told her everything. 3 weeks later, against every instinct screaming in his chest, Emeka finally brought Nkechi home. What happened in that house over the following months was unlike anything Adiz had ever done to any woman before her, because for the first time, Adiz wasn't dealing with someone who could be quietly undermined or slowly poisoned by rumor. Nkechi met every insult with a sharper reply. She met every manufactured doubt with direct, uncomfortable questions Adiz had no polished answer for. And something about Nkechi's refusal to be managed seemed to trigger in Adiz a fear so old and so deep that, for the first time in Emeka's life, he watched his mother's careful mask slip entirely. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, 3 months after Nkechi had first walked through that door. Nkechi had found something. She wouldn't tell Emeka what, not directly. She only said with a strange, unsettled look on her face, that she'd been searching for a missing earring in Adiz's sitting room and had accidentally knocked over a small wooden box tucked behind a stack of old hymn books, and something had fallen out of it that made her stop breathing. "I need to ask you something," Nkechi said, sitting very still across from him, "and I need you to actually answer me instead of protecting her. Ask me. Did you have a sister?" The question hit Emeka like a physical blow. He blinked, genuinely confused, genuinely certain he had misheard her. "What? No. I'm an only child. You know that. Are you sure?" "Nkechi, what kind of question is that? Of course I'm sure. I would know if I had a sister." "Would you?" she asked, and there was something in her voice now, not accusation, but a kind of frightened pity, the look of someone who has stumbled onto a wound so deep the person carrying it doesn't even know it's there. Because I found a photograph, Emeka. A young woman. She has your eyes. Your exact eyes. And on the back someone wrote a name and a date, and the date, Emeka, the date is only 2 years after you were born. Emeka felt something cold spread through his chest, the particular cold of a truth arriving before the mind is ready to receive it. Show me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But when they went to the sitting room to retrieve the box, it was gone. The hymn books were stacked neatly, undisturbed, exactly as they had always been. And when Adiz walked into the room 10 minutes later and found her son and the woman he loved standing there with matching expressions of dread, her face went through a transformation Emeka had never witnessed in 31 years of being her son. For one unguarded second, barely long enough to register, but long enough that both of them saw it, Adiz Obiora looked afraid. Then the mask came back down, smooth and immovable as stone. "What are you two doing in here?" she asked, her voice pleasant, ordinary, as though nothing at all had happened. "Mama," Emeka said carefully. "Did I have a sister?" The silence that followed lasted only 4 seconds, but it stretched in that room like something with weight and mass, pressing against the walls, pressing against Emeka's chest until he could barely breathe. "Where did you hear such nonsense?" Adiz finally said. It was not a question. It was a command disguised as one, an instruction to drop the subject entirely, delivered in the same tone she had used his whole life to end conversations she did not want to have. "Nkechi found a photograph. A girl. With my eyes." "Nkechi," Adiz said slowly, turning to look at the younger woman for the first time since entering the room, and something in the way she said the name made the temperature in the room drop several more degrees. "Has been going through my private things. I wasn't looking for anything, I was searching for." "It doesn't matter what you were searching for," Adiz said, and her voice had changed now, had lost its practiced pleasantness entirely, revealing something underneath that neither of them had ever heard before, something that sounded disturbingly like grief wearing the mask of anger. "Some things in this house are not yours to find. Some things are not anyone's to find. Do you understand me?" "Mama, just answer the question," Emeka said, and for the first time in his adult life, he heard his own voice shaking. "Did I have a sister?" Adiz looked at her son for a long moment, and something passed behind her eyes. 30 years of something, compressed into a single silence, before she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You did not have a sister," she said. "You had something else. And if you keep pulling at this thread, Emeka Obiora, I promise you it will not just unravel my past. It will unravel everything you think you know about your own life. So I am asking you, not telling you, asking you to let it go. For your own sake. Not for mine." It was the first time Adiz Obiora had ever asked her son for anything instead of simply arranging his life around her wishes without permission. And it terrified Emeka more than any threat ever could have, because it told him with absolute certainty that whatever was buried in that photograph was something his mother genuinely feared. Nkechi left the house that same night, not because Adiz drove her away with insults or rumors, but because she looked at Emeka, standing frozen in the hallway, staring at his mother instead of demanding answers, and she understood something that broke her heart far worse than any of the sharper things Adiz could have said to her directly. "You're not going to push her," Nkechi said quietly, pulling on her coat. "Even now, even with something this big sitting right in front of you, you're going to let her decide what you're allowed to know about your own life. Nkechi, please just give me time to. I've given you 8 months, Emeka. I've given you every version of patience I know how to give. But I just watched a grown man ask his mother a direct question and accept a non-answer because she looked upset. That's not a relationship I can build a future inside of. That's not a family I want to bring children into." She paused at the door, her hand on the frame, the same spot where Blessing had once stood, delivering the same kind of parting judgment, though neither woman would ever know they'd stood in that exact place saying nearly the same thing. "Find out who that girl in the photograph was," she said. "For your own sake, not mine. Because until you do, you are going to keep losing every woman who ever tries to love you. And you won't even understand why." She left, and this time, Emeka did not sit in his car listening to a voicemail. This time he walked. straight into the sitting room where his mother sat with her Bible closed in her lap, staring at nothing, and for the first time in his life, he did not back down. "I want to see that box," he said. "Tonight. Or I swear to you, Mama, I will burn this entire house to the ground looking for it myself." Adiz looked up at her son slowly, and in her eyes was something that made his blood run cold. Not anger, not fear this time, but something almost like relief, as though a weight she had carried for 3 decades was finally terribly about to be set down. "Sit down, Emeka," she said quietly. "It's time you knew about your father's first wife." Emeka sat down slowly, the way a man sits when his legs no longer trust the floor beneath them. "My father's first wife," he repeated. "Mama, what are you talking about? My father married you. There was no one before you." "There was," Adiz said, and for the first time in Emeka's entire life, her voice had no performance in it at all, no smoothness, no careful architecture, just a tired, cracked honesty that frightened him more than any of her sharpest words ever had. "Her name was Emeka. Your father married her when he was 22 years old, 3 years before he ever met me. They had a daughter together, a little girl named Chidinma." The name landed in the room like something physical. "She would have been your sister," Adiz continued, staring at a spot on the wall just past Emeka's shoulder, as though she could not bear to look at him directly while she spoke. "Older than you by 2 years. That is the photograph Nkechi found. Chidinma at 4 years old, the last picture ever taken of her." "Mama, I don't understand. What happened to her? What happened to this whole family you're telling me existed?" Adiz's hands folded in her lap, tightened until her knuckles went pale. "Emeka died," she said, "when Chidinma was 5 years old. A fever the hospitals here could not treat in time. Your father was left alone with a small daughter, grieving, drowning, and 2 years later, he met me at a wedding in Owerri, and within 8 months we were married. So I did have a sister." Emeka's voice broke on the word, and he hated himself for how much it broke, for how much a stranger's face in a photograph could undo a grown man in the space of a single sentence. "Where is she, Mama? What happened to Chidinma?" The silence that followed was the longest of Emeka's life. He watched his mother's face work through something, grief, guilt, and something else beneath both of those, something that looked disturbingly like shame. "I could not love her the way I loved you," Adiz finally said. "God forgive me for saying it, but it is the truth, and you deserve the truth tonight, whatever it costs me. When your father brought me into that house, Chidinma was 7 years old, and she looked at me with her mother's eyes every single day, and every single day I felt like a thief standing in a dead woman's kitchen, wearing a dead woman's title, raising a dead woman's child. I told myself I would learn to love her. I told myself it would come with time." She stopped, pressing a trembling hand against her mouth. "It did not come. And children know, Emeka. Children always know when they are not truly wanted, no matter how well you feed them, no matter how well you dress them for church. Chidinma knew. What did you do to her?" The accusation in his voice was sharper than he intended, but he could not stop it, could not stop the image forming in his mind of a small girl, 7 years old, motherless, watching a stranger move into her house and take her father's attention, and understanding, the way children always understand things adults think they've hidden, that she was no longer wanted there. "I did not hurt her," Adiz said quickly, too quickly, and something in the speed of her denial made Emeka's stomach turn cold. "I would never have hurt a child. But I was cold to her, Emeka. I was cold in ways I am only now, at 63 years old, able to admit to myself in the quiet of the night. I favored you the moment you were born. I made no effort to hide it. And when Chidinma was 14, she began to disappear for hours at a time, and by the time she was 16, she was gone for entire nights, and your father, who I loved, who was a good man in every way but this, your father could not bear to discipline her the way she perhaps needed, because he was still drowning in guilt over her mother's death, and I could not bring myself to step into that role, because some ugly part of me had decided years earlier that she was not truly mine to raise. So what happened to her?" It was no longer a question. It was a demand, low and dangerous, the voice of a man standing at the edge of something he could not yet see the bottom of. "She left," Adiz whispered. "The week she turned 18 she packed one bag and she left this house, and she told your father, standing in that very doorway you're sitting near right now, that she would rather starve alone in Lagos than spend one more night under a roof with a woman who looked at her like a burden. Adi's voice finally broke completely, the mask gone, 30 years of buried grief pouring out of her all at once. Your father searched for her for 6 years, Emeka. 6 years. He hired people. He put announcements in newspapers. And 2 years before he died, we received a single letter, no return address, only a Lagos postmark, telling us she was alive, that she did not want to be found, and that she never wanted to hear either of our names again. Emeka sat frozen, trying to fit this enormous, devastating shape into the story of his life. A life he had believed, until this exact moment, was simple. An only child. A widow mother. A dead father he barely remembered. He had never once imagined an older sister, cast out into the world by the very woman who had spent his entire life claiming to protect him from everyone else who dared to love him. That's why, he said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces, each one more sickening than the last. That's why you did it. To Ifeoma. To Blessing. To Nkechi. That's why you couldn't let me love anyone fully. Adiz looked up at him, and in her eyes was something raw and undefended, something Emeka had genuinely never seen in his mother's face in 31 years. I lost a daughter because I let jealousy and fear make a stranger out of my own family, she said. I swore, standing in this house after your father died, that I would never let anything take you from me the way my own coldness took Chidinma from us. I did not know how to love without also controlling Emeka. I did not have anyone to teach me the difference. And so every woman who came close to you, every woman who threatened to become more important to you than I was, I saw a version of the same fear. That I would lose you the way I lost her. That you would leave the way she left, and I would spend the rest of my life writing unanswered letters into the dark. If this story is making your chest tighten right now, you are not alone. Take a moment, drop a comment below and tell me honestly, has fear ever made someone in your life hold on so tightly they nearly destroyed the very thing they were trying to protect? Like this video if this story is affecting you, because what happens next changes everything you thought you understood about who the real victim in this family has been all along. Emeka did not sleep that night. He sat in his car outside the house until dawn, replaying every ruined relationship of his adult life through this new, terrible lens. Ifeoma's face at the dinner table, Blessing's voice breaking in the doorway, Nkechi's hand on the frame as she told him he would keep losing every woman who ever tried to love him. He had always believed his mother's interference came from an excess of love, twisted and controlling but rooted at least in wanting good things for him. Now he understood it came from something closer to terror. A woman so afraid of repeating one catastrophic failure that she had built an entire second one on top of it, brick by careful brick, without ever once realizing what she was doing. He thought of Chidinma, a sister he had never met, cast into the world at 18 with nothing but a single bag and a wound that never healed enough to let her write a return address. Somewhere out there, if she was even still alive, a woman in her 60s was walking around with his exact eyes, and she did not know that her younger brother had spent his entire life orbiting the same darkness that had once driven her away. He made a decision in that car, watching the sun rise over Enugu, that would reshape the rest of his life. He was going to find her. It took him 4 months, 3 private investigators, and a devastating amount of money to trace the letter's postmark to an old address in Ajigunle that had long since been abandoned, and from there to a trail of employment records, a marriage that had ended in divorce, a name change that nearly buried her completely. But on a humid Tuesday afternoon in October, Emeka Obiora stood outside a modest bungalow in Surulere, staring at a woman in her early 50s who was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 rusted poles, and he understood, the moment she turned and looked at him, exactly whose eyes he had inherited. Chidinma, he said, his voice barely holding together. The woman froze, a wet cloth still gripped in her hand, water dripping onto the dust at her feet. For a long moment she said nothing at all, simply studied his face with an expression Emeka could not read, shock perhaps or recognition, or something far more complicated than either. You have his face, she finally said, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. Chukwuemeka's face. I would know it anywhere. I'm Emeka. I'm your. I know who you are, she interrupted, and something hardened in her voice, 31 years of carefully maintained distance snapping back into place like a door slamming shut. The son she finally got to love properly. The one worth staying for. Chidinma, please, I didn't know you existed until 4 months ago. I swear to you I had no idea. That doesn't surprise me, she said, turning back to her laundry, her hands trembling as she pinned another cloth to the line. She erased me completely, didn't she? Not a photograph on the wall. Not a story at dinner. Nothing. As if I was never born into that family at all. She stopped, her shoulders rigid, her back still to him. Why are you here, Emeka? What could you possibly want from me after 31 years of not existing to any of you? I want to know you, he said. I want to understand what happened. And I think there's something you need to know too. Something about our mother that might change how you see all of this. Chidinma turned slowly, and there were tears standing in her eyes now. Tears she was clearly fighting with every ounce of the fierce control that had kept her alive and independent for 3 decades. Our mother, she repeated, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. She was never my mother, Emeka. She made sure I understood that every single day of my childhood, in 100 small ways she probably thought were invisible. What could you possibly tell me about her that would change anything now? Emeka took a breath, steadying himself for the words that would either begin to heal something broken for 3 decades, or shatter it completely and permanently. She's dying, he said. The doctors give her 6 months, maybe less. And 2 weeks ago, for the first time in my entire life, I watched my mother cry. Not for herself, Chidinma. For you. She has your photograph on her nightstand now. She looks at it every single night. And she told me with her own mouth that the single greatest regret of her entire life is that she never learned how to love you before it was too late to try. Chidinma stood very still in that small, dusty yard in Surulere, the wet laundry forgotten in her hands, and somewhere behind her carefully maintained composure, Emeka watched 31 years of buried grief begin, for the very first time, to crack. Chidinma did not speak for a long time. She simply stood there in that dusty yard, laundry forgotten in her hands, staring at a brother she had met only minutes ago, trying to decide whether the words he'd just spoken were a gift or a trap. 6 months, she finally repeated, her voice flat, guarded. And she sent you. After 31 years of silence, she sent her favorite child to deliver the news, instead of coming herself. She doesn't know I'm here, Emeka said quickly. She doesn't know I found you. Chidinma, I need you to understand. I only learned you existed 4 months ago. I spent every day since then trying to find you, not because she asked me to, but because I couldn't live with the idea of an entire sister erased from my life without at least trying to understand why. Something in his voice must have carried enough truth to reach her, because the rigid line of her shoulders softened, just slightly, and she set the wet cloth down on a plastic chair beside the laundry line. Come inside, she said finally. Before the neighbors start asking questions I don't have the strength to answer today. They sat across from each other at a small wooden table in a home that was modest but carefully kept, and for 3 hours Chidinma told him everything Adi's version of the story had left out. The years of being seated slightly apart from the family at church, the birthday parties where her father, drowning in his own unresolved grief, would sometimes call her by her dead mother's name without noticing. The particular loneliness of being 7 years old and understanding, with the terrible clarity children are capable of, that you are tolerated in a house rather than wanted in it. I used to sit outside your bedroom door when we were small, she admitted, staring down at her hands, just to listen to her sing to you at night. She had this lullaby, I don't even know where she learned it, some old Igbo song about a river finding its way home. She never once sang it to me. Not one single time in 11 years. She looked up and her eyes were wet again. I used to think if I just tried harder, was quieter, needed less, maybe she would sing it to me too eventually. She never did. Emeka felt something break open in his own chest. An old familiar guilt he hadn't fully examined until this moment, because he remembered that lullaby. He remembered it clearly, remembered falling asleep to it 1,000 nights of his childhood, warm and safe and utterly unaware that just down the hallway, a little girl was listening through a closed door, waiting for a love that would never come. I'm sorry, he said, and the words felt absurdly small against the size of what they were trying to cover. I didn't know. I swear to you, Chidinma, I didn't know any of this was happening while I had everything you were being denied. It's not your fault, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. her voice hardening again into the practiced steadiness of a woman who had survived by refusing to fall apart in front of people. You were a child too. None of it was your doing. She paused. But I don't know if I can go see her, Emeka. I don't know if I have 31 years of forgiveness sitting anywhere inside me, even for a dying woman. I'm not asking you to forgive her, he said. I'm asking you to decide for yourself whether you want to spend the rest of your life wondering what you might have said to her if you'd had the chance, once it's too late to ever find out. If this moment is hitting you the way it's hitting me, subscribe right now if you love stories built on real suspense and unexpected turns, because what happens in the next few minutes will completely change how you see everyone in this story. The villain, the victim, and the truth sitting quietly underneath both. Chidinma arrived at the house in Enugu 11 days later, on a gray Thursday afternoon, wearing a plain blue dress and carrying nothing but a small handbag, her spine held so straight it looked as though it might snap under the weight of 31 years pressing down on it at once. Adiz was sitting in the same chair by the window where she had spent most of her final months, a blanket over her knees despite the warmth of the day, her once formidable frame reduced by illness into something smaller, softer, less certain of itself. When Chidinma stepped into the doorway, Adiz's breath caught audibly, and for a long moment, neither woman moved. You look like her, Adiz finally whispered. Uzo Amako. You look exactly like her now. I used to be so afraid of that. When you were small, every year you grew older, you looked more like the woman whose life I stepped into, and I hated myself for how much that used to frighten me instead of comfort me. Is that why? Chidinma asked, her voice tight, controlled, 31 years of the question finally given room to breathe. You could never look at me the way you looked at him? Adiz's eyes filled, and for the first time in her son's entire life, Emeka watched his mother cry without shame, without the careful performance she had spent decades perfecting. Yes, Adiz said simply. God forgive me. Yes. Every time I looked at you, I saw a woman I had replaced and a love I could never compete with, and I let that fear turn me into someone who failed you every single day of your childhood, when all you ever needed was for me to simply choose you the way I chose your brother. She reached a trembling hand toward the chair beside her, an invitation Chidinma did not immediately accept. I do not deserve your forgiveness. I am not asking for it. I am only asking for the chance to say, before I am no longer able to say anything at all, that the greatest failure of my entire life was not losing your father's love, or fearing I would lose Emeka's. It was failing to give you what should have cost me nothing at all to give freely. I am sorry, Chidinma. I have been sorry for 31 years, and I let my pride keep me from ever saying it to your face. Chidinma stood in that doorway for a long, unbearable moment, and Emeka watched his sister's entire life pass behind her eyes. Every unsung lullaby, every birthday spent at the edge of a family that never fully claimed her, every year she survived alone in a city that owed her nothing, having built a life out of pure stubborn will because no one had ever taught her she deserved help building one. Then, slowly, she crossed the room and sat down in the chair beside her stepmother's bed. They did not reconcile everything in that conversation. Some wounds, Emeka would learn over the following weeks, are simply too old and too deep to be closed entirely, no matter how much honesty is finally allowed into the room. But something shifted between the two women in those final months, not forgiveness exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that allowed Chidinma to sit beside her stepmother's bed 3 afternoons a week until the end, listening to stories she had spent 31 years being denied, learning finally, far too late to undo the damage but not too late to matter, who her father had truly been, and who Adiz had been before fear turned her into someone smaller than she was capable of being. Adiz Obiora died on a quiet Sunday morning in March, for months after that first reunion, with both of her children in the room. One she had raised with an overprotective, suffocating love that had cost him every relationship he'd ever tried to build, and one she had failed to raise at all, until sickness and mortality finally stripped away the fear that had kept them apart for 3 decades. Her final words, according to Emeka, were not an apology. They were a request. Sing to her, Adiz whispered to her son, her voice barely audible, her eyes fixed on Chidinma. The lullaby. The one about the river. She never got to hear it enough times. Give her all the ones I owed her. And so Emeka, 50 years old by then, sat at his mother's deathbed and sang, in a voice that cracked on nearly every line, an old Igbo lullaby about a river finally finding its way home, sang it to the sister who had spent her entire childhood outside a closed door, listening for exactly this. If you've made it this far into the story, I want you to sit with something for a moment before we finish, because the ending of this story is not the one you might be expecting. Emeka never married. By the time he understood what his mother's fear had cost him, by the time he finally had the language to name what had been done to every woman he had ever loved, and the courage to actually break the pattern instead of simply understanding it intellectually, he was already 61 years old, sitting alone most evenings in a house far too large for one man, with a business he had built successfully and a family history he had finally pieced together completely, and no one beside him to share any of it with. He tried in his 50s to find Nkechi again. He learned, through a mutual acquaintance, that she had married an engineer in Port Harcourt 11 years after she'd walked out of his mother's sitting room, and that she had 3 children, and that she seemed, by every account, genuinely happy. He never reached out. He told himself it would be selfish to disturb a peace he had no right to interrupt, a peace he had, after all, been the one to cost her the first time. He thought of Ifeoma sometimes too, and of Blessing, wondering where the years had carried them, wondering whether either of them ever thought of him the way he still, even now, thought of them, not with longing exactly, but with the particular ache of understanding decades too late, precisely what had been taken and precisely who had taken it. This is the part of the story most people don't want to hear, but it is the truest part, and it is the reason this story exists at all. Sometimes the people who love us the most are also the ones capable of the deepest harm, not because they mean us cruelty, but because their own unhealed wounds teach them to mistake control for protection, possession for love. Adiz Obiora was not a monster. She was a frightened woman who lost one daughter to her own coldness and spent the rest of her life so terrified of losing her son the same way that she destroyed, piece by careful piece, every chance he ever had at building the very family she claimed she wanted for him. And Emeka learned the lesson of his entire life far too late to use it for anything but understanding. Old age did not simply catch up with him. It caught him standing exactly where his mother had left him, in a house full of ghosts and photographs and one unheard voicemail he still, even now, has never had the courage to delete. Before you go, subscribe, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments, what is the biggest lesson you're taking from Emeka's story tonight? Because somewhere out there, someone watching this right now is standing exactly where Emeka once stood, still deciding whether love or fear is going to win. And if this story taught us anything at all, it is this: the people we're most afraid of losing are sometimes the very ones we lose by holding on too tightly. Choose love that lets go, not love that grips until nothing is left to hold.